John Miller drove down the quiet streets of his hometown, Riverdale. It was past midnight and the streetlights cast long shadows across the road. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. 6 months had passed since he returned from his third tour in Afghanistan, but in his mind he was still there. The sounds of explosions and gunfire followed him everywhere. Tonight, the memories were stronger than usual. John had joined the Marines at 19, young and full of hope. He believed in serving his country and protecting freedom. 15 years later, at 38, he returned home a different man. The explosion that took his right leg also took parts of his soul. The doctors called it PTSD. John called it hell. The flashing neon sign of Mike's Bar caught his attention. He pulled into the parking lot and turned off his engine. Maybe a drink would quiet the voices in his head. Just one drink to help him sleep. He reached for his crutches in the back seat and carefully got out of the car. The prosthetic leg the military doctors gave him was good, but it still hurt after a long day. He preferred his crutches when he was tired. Inside, the bar was almost empty. A few locals sat at tables, and an old country song played softly in the background. John found a stool at the end of the bar and sat down. The bartender, a man in his 50s with kind eyes, approached him. "What can I get you?" he asked. "Whiskey." "Neat," John replied. The bartender poured the drink and slid it across the bar. John stared at the amber liquid before taking a sip. The warmth spread through his chest, dulling the pain that never seemed to leave. One drink turned into 2, then 3. With each glass, the memories faded a little more. John lost track of time as he sat there trying to forget. He didn't notice when the bartender started giving him concerned looks. "Maybe you should call someone to pick you up," the bartender suggested when John ordered his 5th drink. John shook his head. "I'm fine, just one more." The bartender hesitated but poured another drink. "Last one," he said firmly. By the time John finally decided to leave, the bar was almost empty. He paid his bill, leaving a generous tip, and made his way to the door. The world tilted slightly as he walked, but he convinced himself he was okay to drive. It was only a few miles to his small apartment. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside. John fumbled with his keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock his car. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, trying to focus. The voice of reason in his head told him to call a cab, but another, louder voice told him he would be fine. He started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. The streets were empty, and John drove slowly, trying to stay in his lane. Was almost home when he saw the flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. His stomach dropped. He pulled over to the side of the road and waited, his heart pounding in his chest. Officer Sam Peterson had been a police officer in Riverdale for 12 years. He had seen many drunk drivers, but something about the man in the blue sedan caught his attention. Maybe it was the way the car weaved slightly between lanes, or maybe it was just instinct. Either way, he decided to pull the driver over. As Officer Peterson approached the car, he noticed the Marine Corps sticker on the back window. Many people in town had similar stickers, showing support for the military, but this one looked worn and faded, like it had been there for years. "License and registration, please," Officer Peterson said, shining his flashlight into the car. John fumbled with his wallet, his fingers not working as well as they should. He handed over his license and reached for the glove compartment to find his registration. "Have you been drinking tonight, sir?" Officer Peterson asked, noticing the smell of alcohol. "Just a couple," John replied, his words slightly slurred. "I'm going to need you to step out of the car," Officer Peterson said. John felt a wave of panic. How could he explain that he couldn't walk in a straight line even when sober? How could he tell this officer that the reason he sometimes stumbled wasn't just alcohol but a missing leg? "Officer, John started, but the words died in his throat. What excuse could he give? Slowly, John opened the door. He reached for his crutches in the back seat. Officer Peterson watched with surprise as John struggled to get out of the car, revealing his prosthetic leg. "Sir, I still need you to take a breathalyzer test," Officer Peterson said, his voice softer now. John nodded. He knew he was over the limit. The test confirmed it. His blood alcohol level was 14, well above the legal limit of 0.8. Officer Peterson had no choice but to arrest him. "John Miller, I'm placing you under arrest for driving under the influence," he said, reading John his rights. As Officer Peterson helped John into the back of the police car, he couldn't help but feel a mix of sympathy and duty. The man was clearly a veteran, probably with stories that would break your heart, but he had also made a dangerous choice that could have hurt others. At the police station, John sat in a cold chair staring at the floor. He answered questions mechanically, providing his information without emotion. Inside, he was crumbling. This wasn't who he was supposed to be. He had survived war only to fall apart at home. They allowed him one phone call. John hesitated before dialing Susan's number. Susan Miller had been his high school sweetheart. They got married right before his first deployment. She had waited for him through 3 tours, writing letters and sending care packages. She deserved better than a middle-of-the-night call from jail. Susan answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Hello?" "Susan, it's me," John said quietly. "I need your help." To her credit, Susan didn't yell or ask a million questions. She simply said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes, and hung up. As John waited, he thought about how his life had changed. Before the explosion, he had been Staff Sergeant John Miller, respected leader of his unit. The men under his command looked up to him. He made quick decisions that saved lives. Now he couldn't even decide if he should drink at home or at a bar. The explosion had happened during a routine patrol. John had noticed something wasn't right about the road ahead. He had ordered his men to stop and take cover. That's when it happened. The blast threw him several feet into the air. When he woke up in the field hospital, his right leg was gone below the knee. But he had saved his unit. Everyone else survived with minor injuries. They called him a hero and gave him medals. But medals didn't help him sleep at night. They didn't stop the phantom pain in a leg that wasn't there anymore. They didn't help him find a job or reconnect with his wife. Susan arrived at the police station looking tired, but determined. She spoke briefly with the desk sergeant, paid John's bail, and helped him to the car. They drove home in silence. John wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. When they arrived home, Susan helped him inside. Their small house was dark and quiet. It was almost 4 a.m. "We'll talk about this tomorrow," Susan said, her voice not angry, just sad. "Get some sleep." John lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He knew he had messed up badly. Driving drunk wasn't just illegal, it was dangerous. He could have hurt someone or himself. The thought made him sick. In the darkness of their bedroom, John made a promise to himself. He would face whatever punishment came his way. He would get help for his drinking and his PTSD. He owed it to Susan, to himself, and to the men who didn't make it back from Afghanistan. As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, John finally fell into a troubled sleep, unaware that his journey through the legal system would lead to an unexpected encounter that would change his life forever. The weeks after John's arrest passed in a blur of paperwork and worry. The court assigned him a lawyer named Greg Peters. Greg was in his 50s with gray hair at his temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had been a public defender for 20 years and had seen many cases like John's. John sat across from Greg in a small office filled with stacks of paper and law books. The room smelled of coffee and old carpet. John's crutches leaned against the wall beside him. "A first time. DUI is serious but not the end of the world," Greg explained, looking through John's file. "However, your blood alcohol level was almost twice the legal limit. That makes things more complicated." John nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. Shame weighed heavy on his shoulders. "Do you have any previous arrests?" Greg asked. "No," John replied. "Nothing. Not even a parking ticket before this." Greg made a note in the file. "That's good. And you're a veteran, correct? How long did you serve?" 15 years. 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Marines." Greg looked up from his notes. "And the prosthetic leg? Was that from your service?" John's jaw tightened. He didn't like talking about it, but he knew it was important for his case. "IED explosion during my last tour. I lost my right leg below the knee." Got a Purple Heart and a medical discharge. Greg's expression softened. I'm sorry, and thank you for your service. He paused. Are you receiving any treatment for PTSD or other issues related to your service? John shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I see a VA doctor sometimes. They gave me some pills for the pain and for sleeping. But the appointments are hard to get, and the pills don't help much. Greg wrote this down too. What about alcohol? How often do you drink? It wasn't a problem before, John said defensively. Just a beer now and then, but since coming home? His voice trailed off. It's okay, Greg said. I'm not here to judge you. I just need to know everything so I can help you. John took a deep breath. Since coming home, it's been harder. The drinking helps with the pain and the nightmares. It makes it easier to forget, at least for a while. Greg nodded. I understand. Many veterans struggle with similar issues. He closed his notebook. Here's what's going to happen. You'll appear before Judge Alan Barton. He's known to be tough on DUI cases, but he's fair. Your military service and lack of prior record will work in your favor. What kind of sentence am I looking at? John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. For a first offense with your blood alcohol level, it could be anywhere from probation and fines to some jail time. It depends on the judge and how your case is presented. John's stomach dropped at the mention of jail. The thought of being confined in a cell brought back memories of the Taliban holding him captive for 3 days before his unit found him. The nightmares would be unbearable in jail. Is there any way to avoid jail? John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Greg leaned forward. That's what we're going to work on. I think we have a good chance with your background and circumstances. But you need to show the court that you're taking this seriously. How do I do that? Start by getting more consistent help for your PTSD and drinking. I can refer you to a veteran support group and a substance abuse program. Judges look favorably on defendants who take steps to address their problems before sentencing. John nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. When John returned home that evening, Susan was waiting for him. She had taken time off from her job as a nurse to support him. Their small living room was clean and warm, but tension filled the air between them. How did it go with the lawyer? Susan asked, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. John told her everything Greg had said. As he spoke, Susan's face showed concern, but not judgment. When he finished, she took his hand in hers. We'll get through this, she said firmly. You're not alone, John. For the first time since his arrest, John felt a small spark of hope. Maybe things could get better. Maybe he could find his way back to being the man he once was. The next morning, John called the number Greg had given him for the Veterans Support Group. The man who answered was named Frank Daniels, another Marine who had served in Iraq. First meeting's tonight at 7, Frank said. Just bring yourself and an open mind. That evening, John found himself in the basement of a local community center. 10 men and 2 women sat in a circle of folding chairs. Some were young, barely, in their 20s. Others were older, veterans of Vietnam and the First Gulf War. What they all had in common were the shadows in their eyes, shadows John recognized all too well. Frank, a tall man with a buzz cut and a prosthetic arm, nodded to John. Everyone, this is John, he's one of us. One by one, the veterans introduced themselves. They didn't just give their names, but also their branch of service where they had served and what brought them to the group. When it was John's turn, he spoke hesitantly at first, then with more confidence as he realized no one here would judge him. My name is John Miller. Marines, 15 years, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Lost my leg to an IED on the last tour. He paused. I got arrested for DUI last month. My lawyer thought this group might help. No one looked shocked or disappointed. Instead, several people nodded in understanding. A woman named Karen, who had served as an Army medic, spoke up. You're not the first one to come here because of legal troubles, and you won't be the last. The important thing is that you're here now. As the meeting continued, John listened to others share their struggles with nightmares, flashbacks, and yes, drinking too much. For the first time since returning home, he didn't feel so alone or broken. After the meeting, Frank approached John. "It gets easier," he said. "Not right away and not all at once, but it does get easier." John began attending the support group, twice a week. He also enrolled in a substance abuse program as Greg had suggested. The days were still hard, filled with pain both physical and emotional, but having a purpose and a community helped. Susan noticed the change in him. One night as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, she took his hand. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. 2 days before his court date, John met with Greg again to prepare. They went over what would happen in court and what John should say if the judge asked him questions. "Remember," Greg said, "be honest but respectful. Judge Barton appreciates people who take responsibility for their actions." The night before his court appearance, John barely slept. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if the judge sent him to jail? What if all his efforts to get help weren't enough? The prosthetic leg throbbed with phantom pain, a painful reminder of all he had lost. Susan found him sitting at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning, a cup of cold coffee in front of him. "It's going to be okay," she said, putting her arms around his shoulders. "No matter what happens today, we'll face it together." John nodded, trying to believe her. He dressed carefully for court in the only suit he owned, the one he had worn to his brother's wedding 3 years ago. It hung a little loose now. He had lost weight since his arrest from stress and from cutting out the alcohol. As Susan drove them to the courthouse, John watched the familiar streets of their town pass by. People were starting their day, heading to work or school, their lives continuing as normal. John wondered if his life would ever feel normal again. The courthouse loomed ahead, a large brick building with stone steps leading to heavy wooden doors. John took a deep breath and grabbed his crutches. It was time to face whatever came next. The courthouse was busy that morning. People rushed through the halls, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. Men and women in suits carried folders and spoke in hushed voices. John sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 3, his crutches leaning against the wall beside him. Susan sat next to him, her hand resting on his arm. Greg arrived 15 minutes before their scheduled time. He wore a dark blue suit and carried a worn leather briefcase. He sat on John's other side and opened his briefcase. "How are you feeling today?" Greg asked, pulling out a folder with John's name on it. "Nervous," John admitted. His hands were shaking slightly. He had been sober for 6 weeks now, the longest stretch since coming home from Afghanistan. The nightmares were still there, but the veterans group was helping him learn ways to cope without alcohol. "That's normal," Greg said. "Just remember what we talked about. Be respectful, answer questions honestly, and let me do most of the talking." At exactly 9:30, the doors to courtroom 3 opened. A court officer stepped out. "Miller case," he called. "Judge Barton's courtroom." John took a deep breath and grabbed his crutches. Susan squeezed his hand one last time before he followed Greg into the courtroom. The room was smaller than John had expected, with wooden benches, a judge's bench at the front, and the American flag standing tall in the corner. A few people sat scattered throughout the room, waiting for their own cases to be called. "All rise, Guy," the court officer announced. The Honorable Judge Alan Barton presiding. Everyone in the courtroom stood as Judge Barton entered. He was a tall man in his early 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. He wore the traditional black robe and carried himself with confidence and authority. John struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his crutches. The prosthetic leg was hurting more than usual today, probably from the stress. Judge Barton sat down and looked out at the courtroom. "Be seated," he said, his voice deep and commanding. Everyone sat down. The judge looked at his calendar. First, case, State versus John Miller, driving under the influence. Greg stood up. "Ready for the defense, Your Honor." The district attorney, a woman named Linda Hayes, also stood. "Ready for the prosecution, Your Honor." Judge Barton nodded. "Proceed." Linda stepped forward. She was in her 40s with short brown hair and glasses. Her voice was clear and confident as she presented the case against John. Your Honor, on the night of April 15th, the defendant was pulled over by Officer Sam Peterson after being observed driving erratically. When tested, his blood alcohol level was 14, nearly twice the legal limit. The state believes this shows a clear disregard for public safety and the law. Judge Barton looked at John with stern eyes. Mr. Miller, how do you plead? Greg had explained that since this was a sentencing hearing, John had already entered his plea in an earlier proceeding. John had pleaded guilty, following Greg's advice that showing responsibility would look better to the judge. He has already entered a plea of guilty, Your Honor, Greg replied. Judge Barton nodded. Yes, of course. Please proceed with your argument, Ms. Hayes. Linda continued, explaining why the state believed John deserved a harsh sentence. She talked about the dangers of drunk driving and the need to send a message to others who might consider driving while intoxicated. When she finished, Judge Barton turned to Greg. Your turn, Counselor. Greg stood up. Thank you, Your Honor. While we do not dispute the facts of the case, we ask the court to consider the unique circumstances surrounding my client. Greg then told John's story. He spoke about John's 15 years of service in the Marines, his 3 tours in Afghanistan, and the IED explosion that took his leg. He explained about the PTSD, the difficulty adjusting to civilian life, and the steps John had taken since his arrest to address his problems. Your Honor, since his arrest, Mr. Miller has been attending a veterans support group twice weekly and has enrolled in a substance abuse program. He has remained sober for 6 weeks and is committed to continuing his recovery. He has no prior criminal record and has served his country with honor and distinction. Greg handed some papers to the judge. These are letters from Mr. Miller's support group leader, his substance abuse counselor, and his commanding officer from the Marines, all attesting to his character and his commitment to rehabilitation. Judge Barton took the papers and read through them carefully. His expression gave nothing away. When he finished reading, he looked directly at John. Mr. Miller, do you have anything you would like to say before I determine your sentence? This was the moment Greg had prepared John for. John slowly stood up, using his crutches for support. He looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, I want to say that I take full responsibility for my actions. What I did was wrong and dangerous. I'm grateful that no one was hurt because of my poor decision. John paused, gathering his thoughts. I've spent my adult life trying to protect others, and that night, I put people at risk. I'm ashamed of that. Since my arrest, I've been working hard to address my issues with PTSD and drinking. I know it doesn't excuse what I did, but I'm committed to making sure it never happens again. Judge Barton listened without interrupting. When John finished, the judge nodded. You may be seated, Mr. Miller. John sat down feeling drained. Saying those words out loud, admitting his mistake in front of everyone, had been hard but also somehow freeing. Judge Barton looked at some notes on his desk, then at John. His face was serious. Before I deliver my sentence, I would like both the defendant and his counsel to approach the bench. Greg looked surprised but quickly stood up. Your Honor, my client uses crutches due to his prosthetic leg. Would it be acceptable if I approach alone? Judge Barton's expression hardened slightly. No, Counselor. I want to speak with Mr. Miller, directly. He will approach the bench. Greg looked at John apologetically. John grabbed his crutches and slowly stood up. The walk to the judge's bench seemed longer than it was. Each step with the prosthetic leg sent pain shooting up his thigh. By the time he reached the bench, sweat had formed on his forehead. Mr. Miller, Judge Barton said, his voice low so only John and Greg could hear. I notice you're having difficulty standing. How long have you had the prosthetic leg? About a year, Your Honor, John replied. It still gives me trouble sometimes, especially when I'm nervous or tired. Something in the judge's eyes changed, a flicker of emotion that was quickly controlled. I see. And do you use the crutches all the time? Most days I can manage with just the prosthetic, but on bad days I need the crutches. Judge Barton nodded. You may return to your seat. John made his way back, aware of everyone's eyes on him. He sat down, feeling exhausted from the short walk and the emotional strain of the day. Judge Barton cleared his throat. In the case of State versus John Miller, Having considered all the evidence and arguments presented, I am ready to deliver my sentence. The courtroom fell silent. Susan, sitting in the row behind John, leaned forward slightly. Greg sat straight, his expression neutral but his eyes watchful. "Mr. Miller, please rise for the sentencing," Judge Barton said. John reached for his crutches again. The pain in his leg had grown worse during the hearing. He struggled to stand, his face showing the effort it took. Judge Barton watched him with an unreadable expression. The courtroom remained silent as John finally got to his feet, leaning heavily on his crutches. "Stand tall, Mr. Miller," Judge Barton said, his voice carrying throughout the courtroom. "Face your sentence like the Marine you are." John stood before Judge Barton, his body tense with pain and anxiety. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had stopped. Everyone watched as the disabled veteran faced the judge. "Mr. Miller," Judge Barton began, his voice firm but not unkind. "Before I deliver your sentence, I want to ask you something." John nodded, his hands gripping his crutches tightly. "Yes, Your Honor." "How many men were under your command in Afghanistan?" The question surprised John. He had expected the judge to talk about his offense, not his military service. 12 in my last tour, Your Honor," John replied. "We were a small unit with specialized training." Judge Barton nodded thoughtfully. "And did you lose any men under your command?" Greg shifted uncomfortably beside John. This line of questioning seemed unusual for a DUI sentencing, but before he could object, John answered, "2, Your Honor." John's voice grew softer. "Private Ryan Simmons and Corporal Dale Matthews. Simmons died in a firefight 3 months into our tour. Matthews stepped on an IED 2 weeks before we were scheduled to return home." The pain in John's eyes was clear to everyone in the courtroom. These weren't just names to him, they were young men he had been responsible for, men he had failed to bring home safely. Judge Barton was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "And the incident that cost you your leg, can you tell the court what happened?" Greg leaned toward John and whispered, "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." But John shook his head slightly. Maybe talking about it openly would help in some way. He took a deep breath. "We were on patrol near a small village. I noticed something wasn't right. About the road ahead, the dirt looked disturbed. I ordered my men to stop and take cover while I checked it out." John paused, his mind going back to that dusty road. "I was right, there was an IED buried there, but I wasn't careful enough when I approached. It detonated." John's right hand unconsciously moved to touch his prosthetic leg. "I woke up in a field hospital. The doctor said I was lucky. The explosion could have killed me. Instead, it just took my leg." Judge Barton leaned forward. "And your men, the ones who were with you that day?" "All survived, Your Honor, some minor injuries, but everyone made it home." "So you saved them," Judge Barton stated. John looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I was just doing my job." Judge Barton stood up suddenly, surprising everyone in the courtroom. He stepped down from the bench and walked around to stand directly in front of John. The judge was tall, almost eye to eye with John despite the step down from the bench. "Mr. Miller," Judge Barton said, his voice different now, less formal and more personal. "I want to tell you something." The judge reached into his robe and pulled out a worn photograph. He held it out for John to see. It showed a young man in a Marine dress uniform, his smile bright and confident. "This is my son Eric," Judge Barton said. "He served 2 tours in Iraq. During his second tour, his unit was ambushed. Like you, he ordered his men to take cover. Like you, he put himself in danger to protect them." Judge Barton's voice grew thick with emotion. "Unlike you, he didn't come home. Not even in a wheelchair or on crutches. He didn't come home at all." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Susan covered her mouth with her hand, tears in her eyes. Greg looked down at his hands, giving the judge a moment of privacy in his grief. Judge Barton carefully returned the photo to his pocket. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. "Every day in this courtroom I see people who take their freedom for granted, people who make choices without thinking about consequences, People who have never had to sacrifice anything for others. He looked directly at John. And then there are people like you and my son. People who gave everything for strangers they would never meet. John stood silently, unsure what to say. He had never expected this moment, this connection with the stern judge who held his fate in his hands. Your Honor, Linda Hayes, the prosecutor, spoke up. While Mr. Miller's service is commendable, we must consider the seriousness of his offense. Judge Barton turned to look at her. I am well aware of the seriousness of driving under the influence, Ms. Hayes. I have sentenced many people to jail for this offense, and I have seen the devastation it can cause. He turned back to John. But I am also aware that justice must be tempered with understanding. Mr. Miller's crime did not happen in isolation. It happened in the context of pain, both physical and emotional, that most of us cannot imagine. Judge Barton returned to his seat behind the bench. He looked at the papers in front of him, then at John, who was still standing with obvious discomfort. You may be seated, Mr. Miller, the judge said, his voice gentler now. John sat down with relief, the pain in his leg becoming almost unbearable. Susan, sitting behind him, reached forward to touch his shoulder in support. Judge Barton looked out at the courtroom before speaking again. I have been a judge for 23 years. In that time, I have learned that the law is not just about punishment. It's also about rehabilitation and redemption. It's about recognizing that people can make mistakes and still deserve a chance to make things right. He turned his attention back to John. Mr. Miller, you have pleaded guilty to driving under the influence. You have taken responsibility for your actions. You have also taken steps to address the underlying issues that led to this offense. The judge picked up his gavel but didn't bring it down yet. I am sentencing you to 2 years of probation. During this time, you will continue with your Veterans Support Group and Substance Abuse Program. You will perform 100 hours of community service, preferably working with other veterans. Your driver's license will be suspended for 6 months and you will pay a fine of $1,000. Linda Hayes stood up. Your Honor, the state recommends a minimum of 30 days in jail for this level of offense. Judge Barton looked at her steadily. I am aware of the state's recommendations, Ms. Hayes. However, I believe that in this particular case, jail time would do more harm than good. Mr. Miller's rehabilitation is better served by allowing him to continue his treatment and by having him give back to the community, especially to other veterans who may be struggling with similar issues. Judge Barton turned back to John. Mr. Miller, do you understand the terms of your sentence? John nodded, relief washing over him. Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Don't thank me, Judge Barton said firmly. This is not leniency. This is a different kind of accountability. I expect you to take your rehabilitation seriously. I expect you to use this opportunity to heal and to help others heal. Can you do that? John straightened his shoulders as much as he could while sitting. Yes, Your Honor. I can, and I will. Judge Barton nodded, satisfied. Good. He brought down his gavel. Court is adjourned. As people began to move and talk, Judge Barton stood up. Instead of leaving through the door behind the bench as judges usually did, he stepped down and walked directly to John. He extended his hand. Staff Sergeant Miller, he said, using John's military rank. My son would have been proud to serve with someone like you. John took the judge's hand, emotion making it hard to speak. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry about your son. He sounds like he was a fine Marine. The finest, Judge Barton agreed, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Just like you. Susan had moved forward to stand beside John. She wiped tears from her cheeks as she watched the exchange between her husband and the judge. Greg stood nearby, a small smile on his face. In all his years as a public defender, he had rarely seen such a personal moment in a courtroom. Mr. Miller, Judge Barton said, his voice low enough that only John, Susan, and Greg could hear. I know the road ahead won't be easy. Recovery never is. But if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who might understand a little of what you're going through, my door is always open. With that, Judge Barton gave John a respectful nod and walked away, his black robe flowing behind him. As he reached the door to his chambers, the judge paused to wipe a tear from his eye, a private moment of grief for the son he had lost, and hope for the veteran whose life he might have helped to save. 1 year had passed since that emotional day in the courtroom. John sat on a bench outside the same courthouse, but today was different. Today he wasn't waiting for his own case to be called. He was waiting to meet with Judge Barton. The spring, air was warm and flowers bloomed in the courthouse garden. John watched people come and go, some with worried faces, others with relief. He understood both feelings well now. His life had changed dramatically in the past year. The probation, which had once seemed like a burden, had become a path to healing. He had not touched alcohol since before his arrest. The Veterans Support Group had become like a second family to him. And most importantly, he had found a purpose, again. John checked his watch. He was early for his meeting with Judge Barton. That was a habit from his Marine days that he had never lost. Early is on time is late. He smiled to himself, remembering his drill sergeant barking those words at his unit. The prosthetic leg still bothered him sometimes, but he had learned to manage the pain better. Physical therapy and regular exercise had strengthened the muscles in his thigh. He rarely needed the crutches now, though he kept them in his car just in case. John reached into his pocket and touched the small coin he always carried. It was his 1-year sobriety chip from his substance abuse program. The smooth metal felt reassuring under his fingers. "John?" a familiar voice called. John looked up to see Judge Barton walking toward him. The judge wasn't wearing his black robe today. Instead, he was dressed in a casual button-up shirt and khaki pants. Without the formal courtroom setting, he looked more like a regular man in his 60s than the stern authority figure John had first met. John stood up, extending his hand. "Judge Barton." The older man shook his hand firmly. "Alan, please, we're not in court today." They began walking together, taking a path through the courthouse garden. "How are you doing, John?" Alan asked. "Your probation officer tells me you've been doing exceptionally well." John nodded. 1 year sober yesterday, he said, pulling out the coin to show Alan. "Some days are harder than others, but I'm doing okay." Alan smiled. "More than okay from what I hear. Nancy at the VA center says you've been volunteering there twice a week, helping other vets navigate the system." John looked slightly embarrassed by the praise. "Just trying to pay it forward. The system can be confusing. A lot of guys give up before they get the help they need." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment. Birds sang in the trees above them, and the sounds of the busy courthouse seemed far away. "I have a proposal for you," Alan said finally. "Something I've been working on for a while." John looked at him curiously. "What kind of proposal?" Alan gestured to a bench, and they both sat down. "For years I've been concerned about veterans coming through my courtroom. Too many of them get caught in the system because they're struggling with the same issues you faced: PTSD, substance abuse, adjusting to civilian life." John nodded. He had seen it himself at the VA and in his support group. Good men and women who had served their country with honor, now lost and struggling. "I've been talking with the chief judge and the county commissioners," Alan continued. "We're starting a veterans treatment court. It's a special court designed specifically for veterans who get into legal trouble due to issues related to their service." "Like a drug court?" John asked. He had heard about specialized courts that focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment for drug offenders. "Similar," Alan nodded, "but tailored to the unique needs of veterans. Instead of just putting them on probation or sending them to jail, we connect them with VA services, treatment programs, and, this is the key part, other veterans who can mentor them through the process." John began to understand where this conversation was heading. "And you want me to be one of these mentors?" Alan smiled. "Not just a mentor. I want you to be the lead mentor coordinator. You would help recruit other veterans to serve as mentors, match them with participants in the YE program, and oversee the mentorship component of the court." John was stunned. "But I'm still on probation myself." "For another month," Alan reminded him, "and your probation officer has already recommended early termination due to your exemplary compliance. The paperwork is on my desk, waiting to be signed." John looked out at the garden, processing this unexpected offer. Why me? There must be other veterans with more experience, more education. Because you've been where these veterans are, Alan interrupted gently. You know what it's like to feel lost, to make mistakes, to struggle with pain, both physical and emotional. And most importantly, you know the way back. John thought about the past year, about the slow, difficult journey from that night of drinking and driving to where he was now. It hadn't been easy. There had been days when the pain and nightmares were so bad that the temptation to drink had been almost overwhelming. But he had made it through those days, one at a time. Would this be a volunteer position? John asked. Alan shook his head. It's a paid position, funded through a grant from the State Veterans Affairs Department. Not a fortune, but enough to live on. And the position comes with health benefits. This was another surprise. John had been working part-time at a hardware store, supplementing his disability pay from the VA. The idea of having a full-time job doing something meaningful was appealing. I don't know what to say, John admitted. Say you'll think about it, Alan suggested. Talk it over with Susan. See if it feels right for you. John nodded. I will. Thank you for considering me. As they stood to continue their walk, Alan put a hand on John's shoulder. There's one more thing. The first case in the new Veterans Treatment Court will be next month. A Marine, back from his second tour in Iraq. He got into a bar fight, hurt someone pretty badly. He's looking at serious charges, but he's also clearly suffering from PTSD. Sounds familiar, John said quietly. That's why I want you there, Alan replied. He needs to see that there's a way forward, that his life isn't over because of one bad night. Later that evening, John sat with Susan on their front porch. The neighborhood was quiet, with just the occasional car passing by. The porch light attracted moths that danced in its glow. So what did you tell him? Susan asked after John explained Alan's offer. That I'd think about it, John replied. What do you think I should do? Susan took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I think you should say yes. You've been happiest this past year when you're helping other veterans. This would let you do that full time. John squeezed her hand. It would mean being in the courthouse a lot, seeing people at their worst moments. It might bring back some difficult memories. You're stronger than you think, Susan said softly. And you wouldn't be doing it alone. I'll be here. Your support group will be here. And it sounds like Judge Barton Allen will be there too. John looked up at the stars appearing in the darkening sky. A year ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. And now? Susan prompted. Now I see that was just the beginning of a different life, John said. Not better or worse, just different. And maybe with a different purpose. The next morning, John called Alan and accepted the position. 6 weeks later, the county's first Veterans Treatment Court convened. John sat beside Alan at the front of the courtroom, not as a defendant this time, but as part of the team helping other veterans find their way back. As the first case was called, John watched a young Marine with haunted eyes enter the courtroom. The man looked a lot like John had a year ago, lost, afraid, ashamed. The young Marine's family sat in the back, their faces showing the same mix of hope and worry that Susan's had shown. When it was John's turn to speak, he stood tall without crutches or visible pain. He looked directly at the young Marine. My name is John Miller, he began. I sat where you're sitting now 1 year ago. I know the road ahead looks impossible right now, but I promise you, you're not walking it alone. As John spoke, he noticed tears in the young Marine's eyes, not tears of despair, but the first tears of release, of the possibility of healing. John recognized them because he had shed the same tears in this very courtroom when a judge had seen past his crime to the wounded warrior beneath. In the back of the courtroom, Susan watched with pride as her husband's words reached not just the young Marine, but everyone present. And beside John, Alan Barton, the judge who had once commanded a disabled veteran to stand for sentencing, sat with quiet satisfaction. knowing that sometimes justice wore the face of compassion, and that healing could begin in the most unexpected places, even a courtroom.